the long shadow of history and the phantom fears of peoples and nations. The Zeitgeist, the people and their governments in the Garden of Goodbyes, by Othniel Max Daves.
Shadows and darkness have long had negative connotations in Western philosophy. It is thought as a state where light, truth, knowledge, and wisdom do not exist. It has to be illuminated honestly and humbly. Let us attempt to do that here to some degree. We live in confused and perilous times. Does it not seem as though the world is under some great darkness? Like a deep shadow has foisted itself upon us. Maybe it has not been foisted upon us as much as it has been by our own choices, actions, perceptions, and projections. Could it be that the collective aggregation of everyone's individual shadows born out of fear, confusion have in effect reached a level of darkness so pervasive that all the world is caught up in its serpent-like coils encircling the entirety of the earth? However, there has never been a time here in this world that has not been afflicted with fearful, confusing, and perilous times. Times most often punctuated with great conflicts, disasters, and even greater suffering during and after them. It is the story of human history in the Shadowlands. Yet are we in our times actually in the same peril and hardships as those generations which preceded ours? However, I scarcely meet anyone who does not sense the heaviness of this enshrouding darkness which the pandemic seemingly caused. Why do you suppose this is? Everyone carries a shadow, Jung wrote, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. It may be, in part, one's link to more primitive animal instincts, which are superseded during early childhood by the conscious mind. Jung stated the shadow to be the unknown dark side of the personality. According to Jung, the shadow, in being instinctive and irrational, is prone to psychological projection, in which a perceived personal inferiority is recognized as a perceived moral deficiency in someone else. Jung writes that, if these projections remain hidden, the projection-making factor then has a free hand and can realize its object, if it is one, or bring about some other situation characteristic of its power. These projections insulate and delude individuals by acting as a constantly thickening veil of illusion between the ego and the real world. So what is projection? Psychological projection is the process of misinterpreting what is inside as coming from outside. It forms the basis of empathy by the projection of personal experiences to understand someone else's subjective world. In its malignant forms, it is a defense mechanism in which the ego defends itself against disowned and highly negative parts of the self by denying their existence in themselves and attributing them to others, breeding misunderstanding and causing untold interpersonal damage. A bully may project their own feelings of vulnerability onto the target, or a person who is confused may project feelings of confusion and inadequacy onto other people. Projection incorporates blame shifting and can manifest as shame dumping. The Babylonian Talmud notes the human tendency toward projection and warns against it. Do not taunt your neighbor with the blemish you yourself have. Religious people of the Christian faith believe that in the New Testament, Jesus also warned against projection.
Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
Jung wrote, all projections provoke counter-projection when the object is unconscious of the quality projected upon it by the subject. Thus, what is unconscious in the recipient will be projected back onto the projector, precipitating a form of mutual acting out. Together, the projection and counter-projection create a mutually self-amplifying, highly dysfunctional conflict cycle. Let's look at what Jesus said again, adding the preceding verses.
For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye.
So take a look around you. What do you not thus see occurring between individuals, peoples, tribes, and nations, Is not this? Is it not projection? Is it not hypocrisy? It is in projecting outward and acting out from one's shadow. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Let us consider together that everything here in this world you build is built in and out of temporary. Temporary cannot by its very nature last beyond its temporariness. Yet we fight and kill one another over it while denying what transcends this temporal reality over what is locked in it. This is insanity. For what fool fights for the very shadow of what is real, destroying themselves and others for the phantom of the authentic? Yet this is what this world was deceived into doing for many millennia. Age after age you pursued the shadow of the real and the shadows of yourselves and empires and kingdoms, only to wind up in the same place every time, sitting amidst the rubble, the ashes, the bones of the dead, and your utter depravity, having been led by those same shadows to oblivion again and again. Since so many are offended by the ancient scriptures of the Bible, permit me to tell you the reason using another ancient text. The Zoroastrian Avestas.
And the ancient serpent went before God Almighty and said, I will deceive and poison them and turn their affections from you to me and destroy them.
Is this not what our history reveals and our present is once again revealing? Yet far too many of us deny this as merely the myths of a superstitious people. We think yourselves so evolved, do we not? So tell me, if we are so evolved, why do we continue to do the very things which those ancient peoples did, which led them to destruction? Perhaps we are deceived. Perhaps that serpent was right and we are, as humanity, are proving that fact by being destroyed by the very things you deny exist, even as those who warn you are seen as somehow less evolved and sophisticated. As for people, so too of the nations. Carl Jung speaks about the projection of evil in this excerpt from The Undiscovered Self.
We are always, thanks to our human nature, potential criminals. In reality, we merely lacked a suitable opportunity to be drawn into the infernal melee. None of us stands outside humanity's black collective shadow. Whether the crime lies many generations back or happens today, it remains the symptom of a disposition that is always and everywhere present, and one would therefore do well to possess some imagination in evil. For only the fool can permanently neglect the conditions of his own nature. In fact, this negligence is the best means of making him an instrument of evil. Harmlessness and naivete are as little helpful as it would be for a cholera patient, and those in his vicinity to remain unconscious of the contagiousness of the disease. On the contrary, they lead to projection of the unrecognized evil into the other. This strengthens the opponent's position in the most effective way, because the projection carries the fear which we involuntarily and secretly feel for our own evil over to the other side, and considerably increases the formidableness of his threat.
Jung's perspective here is indeed insightful. The truth of things can be brought into light by those of the light who shine brightly in the darkest of times, more and more by increasing the luminosity that all might have the opportunity to see at least in part and know in part what was previously hidden from them in the darkness of heart and mind. They are like the illuminating street lamps which light up the road through the night, helping travelers navigate what would have been much more difficult. They are those who seek to reveal what was hidden from view in the shadow by the light of the truth, which sets the prisoners free of those things in the shadow which have kept their minds, souls, and hearts in chains. According to Jung, the shadow sometimes overwhelms a person's actions. For example, when the conscious mind is shocked, confused, or paralyzed by indecision, a man who is possessed by his shadow is always standing in his own light and falling into his own traps, living below his own level. As it is for people, so too for nations and their governments. This is why it is important to speak truth to power and not simply be a critic, but rather one who not only exposes the shadow and what is in it, but also to offer truth and understanding as to how to be freed from it. Such ones are necessary for the reform and restoration of the nation-state and the government itself, which must lead it. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself and represents a tight passage, a narrow door whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. When those in other nations dig up the past to accuse in the present, they not only fear what is in the present, but are also terrified of what is to come. What is this to come, you might be asking? Their exposure in the light of truth of what wrongs they have done or doing and plan to do, hence why they seek to use the past as a means to deny their present predicament, thereby creating their nightmare in the future. This is particularly so when I observe the weaponized narratives projected by various nation-states and groupthink ideologically bankrupt delusionaries. The current use of the colonial past of the West as a diversionary means to deceive people in the present. This paradigm is not one born in colonialism, but rather is one which facilitates it. Corrupt local and regional leadership have always prostituted their people and national resources to foreign powers for unprincipled reasons. The traditional colonial narrative is a diversion which is meant to hide the realities of what is really going on, while the accusations from the past are rerun. The present reality in many nations is that of neo-colonialism by powers such as China and radicalized Islamic groups. The weaponized projective narratives are essentially telegraphical. There is nothing new under the sun, even if it is not politically correct nor profitable to accept this truth. Manufactured complicity with false and out-of-context historical narratives have long been used in fueling the wheel of cyclical dysfunction. Plundering and destruction of people, tribes, and nations. As it is for people, so too it is for nations.
The myth of the peaceful multipolar ordered world and the long collective shadow of history.
To those who desired a multipolar order, respectfully, my friends, I have to disagree. A human being that is multipolar is mentally ill with chaotic thinking, informing and impacting decision-making. Humanity itself is the macro of that micro. The multipolar world is not new. It is rather the default setting of the majority of human history, a history characterized by human suffering, war, and chaos. Nothing in this world exists in a vacuum, not individuals nor nation-states. Individuals in various organizational structures make up nations. As you say, the strength of some nations forming the multipolar gravity wells pull upon the weaker nations in a tension. That tension is what gives way to stressors that impact the various tribal, ethnic, and ideological groupings resident in those nations. It does not create a more peaceful world. Quite the contrary, it creates a much more chaotic one that is never settled and uniformly solid, as human history is quite a witness to. In the near past, the multipolar order was in fact what the world was like prior to WW1. The Western European and Eurasian powers were multipolar. This carried through to WW2, which was characterized the rise of the United States as global hegemonic power. It was not the sole power, however, as many would like to postulate. The European powers and the Soviet bloc also emerged as dominant powers. The binary or quadratic powers post-WW2 of Western Europeans and the USA North American polarity stood opposed to the Soviet bloc. The Soviets and the Maoist Chinese bloc reveal yet two more power poles. During that time of the Cold War, where the unclaimed a fragile peace cost 200 million lives in the binary superpowers proxy wars. No quite the utopian reality now, is it? Be it multipolar or unipolar or bipolar. None of these will end the cyclical millstone of human history as long as people and the nations remain in and living for their own shadows, denying the predicament of doing so. For history left unlearned and truth denied only keeps ourselves and the nations chained to the shadows of the real. The weaponized narrative of Western colonial powers was used by the Soviets to foment opposition and stir up division and confusion in the West as Stalin and Mao fashioned their own hegemonic spheres of influence. This paradigm was implemented to undermine Western liberal democratic ideals and gain control over proxies with which they could control to expand their ability to project their power and influence in the Cold War. This was also couched as a multipolar or counterbalancing strategy. America and the Western powers were seen by the Soviets and Chinese as adversaries ideologically, economically, and politically to their global hegemonic plans. The current trend towards a multipolar order is a historical retrograde, not a progradation in a socio-economic nor politically innovative sense. This should be apparent in the competing hegemonic claims by various nations and worldviews. This is punctuated by the militarization of the process by a multiplicity of nations competing for coveted ownership of one of the multipolar spheres of power and influence. Such trends do not bode well for a more peaceful and free world with greater prosperity and human flourishing. However, it does provide a stark warning to the tribes, peoples, and nations that the opposite is in fact what is being birthed. Thusly, the great upheaval of the global order occurring. Those pushing for the multipolar order do so either in ignorance or machination. How so? While hegemonic powers always rise in the chaos and take by force the reins of the global order, in our times, this is the intent behind both Russian and Chinese ambitions as well as that of the main binary competing political, theocratic hybrid of the Sunni and Shia Mahdi meta-narratives. So too it is for other current civilizational subsets. Everyone truly does want to rule the Shadowlands in their own way. Now isn't that not true? Be it tribes, tongues, or nations, all it seems is desirous of remaking the world in their own fallen image, even if it is on a small scale in their personal lives and professional ambitions. The seed of postmodern philosophy, which has infected so many these days, is found to have its genesis in that same desire. To completely live as though they are the center of their own personal universe of which they alone are the sovereign over. This hyper-subjectivist way of thinking is one of complete selfishness. This is why I call it the me, myself, and I paradox. I do so because it is inherently irrational and self-defeating in its outright demand for its entitlement malady, demanding that others, who presumably also have the same delusionary right, succumb to the absolute will and rights of the other. This, of course, is a self-negating perspective. One cannot claim to be absolutely sovereign over all things if everyone else has the same right to do the same, for this is conflicting. There can only be one absolute ruler, right? How can they be this absolute subjective ruler without the complicity with other people who may also claim the same absolutist right? They can't. Thusly, the competing subjectivists either have to settle for something less than their hegemonic absolutist right or subdue all who would challenge them, lest they have to admit the folly of their prideful demands. Absolute is, after all, well, absolute, being that absolute means unrestricted and or undiminished in any way whatsoever. Even the most cleverly constructed and agreed upon social contract, treaty, or confederation will eventually meet the point of contention where divergence is assured and conflict ensues. As it is for people, so too it is for nations in a multipolar world order. The ideological and aspirational drives of the nations will inevitably come into conflict. Such conflicts will ultimately lead to winners and losers in the conflict. And just like people, nation-states and other organized constructs of human being hate to lose. This strikes at the heart of the absolutist meta-narrative, doesn't it? For the entire edifice of the individual or the nation-state is faced with a dilemma, an existential crisis born or existential threats to their personal or national mythos. This leads to bitterness and a desire to regain preeminence over their rivals and the losers, who then plot to take back their rightful absolutist position, allowing them, the individual, ideological groupthink, or the nation-state, to reclaim both their dominance over rivals and their self-deceiving meta-narrative, which then deceived them even more. This is the same cycle which characterizes the addictions, delusion, and insanity. It is in its end a terminal condition. It always leaves an ever-widening wake of destruction until others have to mitigate it for their own survival or in order to regain their own lost absolutist mythos. This is as much the history of empires as it is the people in those empires. It is the broad path of destruction. What stands in the way of the misguided hegemonic dreamscape of the competing interests? Today is the present global order and its rules-based system born out of the Westphalian ideal. Like the days of Stalin and Mao, the intent is to weaken, corrupt, and discredit the current order, that it might appear that the machinacious alternatives are more legitimate in the eyes of the peoples and nations. Deconstruction of the old order always precedes the introduction of the desired replacement. This characterizes the folly of human history and the rise and fall of empires and nations. This is why so many are intent on undermining the worldview which allowed for the present order to come into being. Worldview matters, understanding that competing worldviews rarely, and arguably have never, succumbed to their competitors and adversaries without terrible consequences to all. Economics alone are not sufficient as to create lasting bonds of a peaceful order either. As history has already revealed, one has to deny history and human nature together to suggest otherwise. Entropy does have its effects regardless of the best laid hopes and plans. Human vulnerability to corrosive and corruptive influences inherent within always infect the order regardless of political ideologies, philosophic or economic foundations. Proper checks and balances and separation of powers there wherein is necessary to mitigate such inevitable dark forces at work in and upon human civilization. Complexity makes this much more difficult while increasing systematic fragility in doing so. The way of nations have always been competitors at best and enemies at their worst. This dynamic is the norm. A hegemonically competitive multipolarity will not lead to lasting peace, but rather more wars and social unrest. This is why the nations are arming themselves. This is why the strategic, economic, and political alliances are being tested and reinvented along those aspirational lines. This will not be a rerun of the Cold War. It will be a much more dangerous and chaotic world. As such, the cascade effects thereof will be many and deeply felt by all nations, impacting economic output and social cohesion. When adding cascading impacts from cyclical natural patterns such as the grand solar minimum in the prevailing global zeitgeist, one can expect an extremely turbulent period of history which will not be in line with the corporatocratic, technocratic, utopian vision many have for the world at large. This is the reality, so I stand firm on my position that the multipolar wish might in fact be a death wish more than a dream come true. As I said, nothing happens in a vacuum. The aggregated micros do in fact create the macros. That is present in all of nature. It is fractal level scalable, both up and down in resolution. I am not speaking on this from a vacuum, and we are not having this discussion in a vacuum. The impacts are real. Reality is to some degree or another malleable within a mathematical and metalogical framework, but certain outcomes of convergent trends are historically obvious. Human nature and the nature of nations are predictable to some degree at a certain level where certain convergent trends are present. That is why history is both a willing and a stern teacher to those who remain students of its lessons. The lack of predictability is cocooned inside what is predictable. This becomes more complex in the micros for specific predictable personal events. No human being nor computational methodology can be nor will be all-seeing and knowing as to all potentials. It is folly to think anything born of and manufactured in temporal finiteness can transcend its own temporariness to obtain infinite understanding on all things. To follow such a path is a fool's errand, only superseded in its foolishness by the despotic pride necessary to reach such great depths of self-deception. Black swan events do happen which alter the course of history in micro and macro ways. Even now those black swans are in flight beyond the horizon of those who will be most affected by them. Take heed. Be humble or be humbled with great consequences.
A brutal reality.
There is a way which seems right to human beings, but in the end its way is the broad path to destruction. So you want a multipolar world. So the world wants to arm the nations one more time and play games of chance, machination, and profiteering. Over 200 million died in superpower-involved proxy and civil wars during the multipolar Cold War years. The resulting disease outbreaks and famines killed many millions more. This should have been a stark reality kick to the teeth for the nations. The next war will not be fought in the manner which this occurred and is still occurring. It will be fought with both the proxies and the multipolar superpowers going head-to-head regardless of how clever the major powers think they are. No nation nor any domain of human existence will be left untouched. The human costs and economic losses will be unprecedented. No nation is innocent on their own merits. That is why God's divine justice comes to all peoples, tribes, and nations. It is also why it is He always offers everyone a way out of the shadow of war and self-destruction individually and collectively in the light of the truth. As it is for people, so too it is for nations.
Know thyself, know thy enemy, know thy ally.
Knowing thyself is to know thy own worst enemy when it comes to both individuals and organizations. If you don't know who or what you are connected to, you probably have no idea what your weakness and vulnerabilities are. If you do not know what your own weaknesses are, then you cannot address them and turn them into strengths. The first step is to admit you have a problem. The second step is to mitigate the problem by taking the step to begin a methodical mapping process. This process will never fully be completed, however, once you have the initial mapping done, keeping it dynamically updated will be much easier. This will not be your typical org chart or network map. It will be a dynamic and actively ongoing comprehensive relationship mapping which will reveal the intersections of various networks related to all aspects of your organization. You will find that where those intersections are revealed, there also you will find your security vulnerabilities. The term threat vector is used due to how threat actors zero in on their specific targets. Those potential targets are your known and unknown vulnerabilities. You cannot defend nor protect what you don't know you have. Hence why I say know thyself and know thy worst enemy. Your weaknesses. This task takes courage and humility, although in the end it will be of great profit to you and your organizations. So it is for people, so too it is for organizations and government. As Jung stated,
An individual makes an attempt to see his shadow. He becomes aware of those qualities and impulses he denies in himself but can plainly see in others, such things as egotism, mental laziness, and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possessions.
so it is for nations and the governments who must lead them. Hence, in terms of the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it must be Jekyll, the conscious personality, who integrates the shadow, and not vice versa. Otherwise, the conscious becomes the slave of the autonomous shadow. You cannot change what you cannot see needs to be changed. You cannot fight what you do not know war against you. And you cannot love nor be loved what you do not know is worthy of love when you do not know what love truly is. Thus begins the path out of the shadows and the breaking of the chains of that which you could not previously see nor knew was an enemy to your best interests, including one's own health and well-being. In conclusion, applying Jung's theory on the shadow might well apply to all parties here if we are honest enough about it. This current situation did not occur in a vacuum of the recent events over the past 2 presidencies. It is one which has its roots in period of the Cold War and prior to the fall of the Soviet Union from an American and NATO point of view. From the Russians' point of view, the roots that go back long before that historically. The shadow of the past casts a long shadow forward in history and matters of state. Hence why the shadow emerges in our present time as an ongoing thing seen too often short-sightedly by some and far too distant in other ways deep into the past. What is for certain is that all involved are at once operating from insufficient and, dare I say, incomplete points of view. This is so because all have both corrupt goals and objectives as well as valid reasons for concern. Both start with the personal perceptions of leaders involved and that of their respective nations. Much water has gone under the dilapidated bridge, so to speak, over the past couple of centuries, and in particularly during the Cold War. Such dark rivalries as adversaries have during latter half of the 20th century do leave their geopolitical scars. Fears and distrust. These can remain relics of the past which can be resolved in the present, or they can remain low-grade infections that can burst into gangrene-like rot in relations, leading to only more distrust, conflict, and destructive consequences. Nation-states, like people, can only move beyond this by individually looking at one's own shadow and confront that which was hidden from view in the darkness of denial, fear, bitterness, a desire for revenge, and pride, which form the chains which tethered both people and nations to destructive and desolative cycles of projection and displacement, fueling only more of what caused the maladies in the first place. This is the predicament of all nations and peoples. For at people who form the nations, they lead the nations. They also can transform nations for good or for evil in service to the light of truth or the darkness of lies. The former leads to reformation, restoration, reconciliation, and reclamation of the authentic and lasting, while the latter leads only to the dark energies which keep the millstone of human history revolving, churning and crushing what could have been under the unfathomable weight of what was that is denied, ignored, blamed upon others, and left to render the future into more of the same. As I say often, there be no nation on earth nor individual in them that are found righteous upon their own merits alone without corruptions, failures, and evils which have not impacted themselves and others. When ready to understand this and accept it, then you'll be able to move beyond it, starting with yourselves while extending it in grace and peace to others. It takes courage and it takes faith. As for people, so too for nations.
A call to all leaders and citizens to leave their chains behind in their shadow.
When things are uncertain during times of crisis, the difficulties of public and private leadership are amplified. It is important to speak truth to power. However, it is also important to encourage, pray for, and support leadership. It is a noble call to all beyond the differences, disagreements, and even rivalries. for it is the decisions of leaders which impact us all for better or for worse. It is in all Americans' best interests to pray for God to bestow divine wisdom, heavenly protection, and clarity of purpose for our leadership, that they might be endowed with the spiritual vision, presence of mind, humility, courage, and steadfastness of heart to make the decisions and take actions that lead the nation through the storms of our times. For it is the humble and courageous self-sacrificing servant leader who knows the great weight of their responsibility and seeks the wisdom, strength, and guidance of God Almighty, that in His grace and the light of heaven's eternal truth, that the frailties and temptation which all mortal coils are subject to, not be a hindrance to the tasks at hand to lead all for the good of all in all truth, love, justice, and mercy. Leaders are human beings just like everyone else. It is easy to lose sight of that. The clock is running out on those who remain wedded to their pride, lies, and intrigues. Even the greatest of deceptions have ever-shortening lifespans. So too it is with all that occurred in this crisis. All will be made known, nothing will be left hidden, and the consequences then rendered. Can you not see you all were made for so much more than the counterfeits? The lies, the evil will ever permit, for the moment you realize what it is, what it has done, what it is doing, to who and what you were meant to be. There and then you will have seen how the shadow and all that was done in it, all that you did in it, all that was done to you and by you to others in it, was serving the very force that had always sought your enslavement and destruction. For the shadow cannot exist in and of its own. It needs that which is substance and real, and it needs the true light for it to exist. It cannot exist without you allowing it to deceive you into becoming what it is, a lie. It cannot exist without reversing the truth of reality around upon you, making you think you need it, when in fact it needs you. The pride of the shadow cannot allow itself to expose nor admit its pitiful and wretched dependence, so it offers what it does not have. It tempts with what cannot satiate. It deceives with what it can never be. True, it also cannot be the real you, that personage that it seeks to blind you to and keep you from becoming should you find the way of truth and be freed from its phantom claws clutching you with all that is beneath you. For it is the shadow that once slain becomes a mighty stallion in the light which serves you rather than what was. You enslaved to it in the darkness, for it is the truth which sets the prisoner free. Free from what was previously hidden in the darkness of the shadows. For nothing good dwells in the darkness of heart and mind. For what does dwell there wherein is a parasite, a pathogen, a fraud, a fearful and terribly insecure weakling? Yet for all this time it has ruled by projecting what it is upon you and stealing from you what you actually are and can be. All of this time it inverted the reality of things and convinced you that it was what you actually are, that it has been fighting with all it has to keep you from. Do not cede any more to it. Take what it stole from you back. How you say, by allowing the blazing sword of the truth to slay the beast of the shadows. The light of the truth expose all the vipers of avarice and hubris which find refuge in that devilish shadow and its thick darkness. For it has no power in heaven nor on earth against the truth and love that brings about justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts set ablaze by the Spirit of God Almighty. Let us not forget that we all wrestle with these insufficiencies in our own hearts, minds, and bodies. Let us also not deny our own need for grace and truth, nor that of our fellow citizens and those charged with leading us all. For it is in perilous times all are tested. The rain falls upon the just and unjust alike. So too it is for all the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations. Let us not give in to the lesser of our angels in fear, confusion, selfishness, and pride. For these are of the darkness and bring only suffering, division, avarice, and hubris that emboldens evil and diverts our gaze from heaven's power and glory and seeks to redirect it to counterfeits of the most basest, deceptive and destructive phantoms of the authentic. Let us not allow the darkness to extinguish the light of truth and love from humble and contrite hearts, that justice and mercy might flourish, and healing and reconciliation might thrive despite the peril and the machinations of evil in our times. Let us find courage in the face of fear, love in the face of hatred, unity in the face of the winds of division, clarity in the face of uncertainty, and encouragement in the face of discouraging forces, thoughts, and circumstances. Let us come together to find a renewed sense of purpose in the face of dissipation, Let it be that we foster inspiration and hope in the light from within and above, from the least of us to those in the heights of the land. Let us replace callousness and bitterness with kindness and forgiveness. Let it be that we each choose to be living examples of what can be, when all look out for the highest good of others. Let us together change the trajectory of our nation and one another this day. May it be that we let that change begin with each of us right here and right now, in each of our hearts, minds, words, and deeds. May it be that we truly become e pluribus unum, strong in the strength of God Almighty, born of faith, love, and a peace which passes all understanding, yet transforms our nation and indeed the entire world. For divided we fall, and united we rise together and stand above the lies, our circumstances, the perils thereof, and the fear and confusion that wages war upon all of our very souls. For we can and we will overcome the darkness and the evil done in that darkness by goodness and the light of the truth. There is nothing we cannot overcome in this way. Now rise and stand together as one. God bless you all and grant you grace and peace in all truth and love. And may God Almighty bless these United States of America. As for people, so too for the nation and nations. Respectfully, Othniel Max Daves. Now permit me to share this fine article by Jim Jarity, which states it another way, focused on America specifically.
Jungian Shadow Politics by Jim Jarity, May 2, 2018. A funny video dissecting the philosophical problems in Star Wars. The Last Jedi is an unexpected spur for an explanation of the intensity of our national political divisions, but its discussion about the theories of psychologist Carl Jung can easily be applied to the deep emotions driving the furious hostility in our national discourse. Jung's theory in a nutshell. Carl Jung believed that scapegoating revealed something fundamental about our psyche. He maintained that we all have a shadow side to our personality. As he wrote in Archetype and the Collective Unconscious, the shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. Our shadow aspects cause us anguish, and much of our mental energy is enlisted in the denial of our perceived imperfections. But we cannot see our shadow aspects except through projection. In Alchemical Studies, Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious." In short, we all have parts of ourselves that we're not proud of and sometimes deny exists. Hate, lust, greed, selfishness, cruelty, jealousy, narcissism, laziness. You can probably think of some others. Some argue that the traits we dislike most in other people are the traits we dislike most about ourselves. And sometimes we can become so adamant to deny that aspect of ourselves that we seek it out and furiously denounce those traits in other people. If we on the right are honest, we'll recognize that there are times we both personally and collectively don't live up to our own values or how we want to see ourselves. We have religious leaders who get caught in embarrassing sex scandals, and we have people who think of themselves as believing in family values but who are deadbeat dads and irresponsible mothers. We have business leaders who do prioritize profits over the well-being of their employees. Irresponsible gun owners exist. Bad cops exist. Not everyone who wears our country's uniform does so with honor and distinction. We tout the value of hard work but get lazy. We denounce big government but relish its spending when it benefits us personally. And if liberals are honest, they'll recognize that there are times that they both personally and collectively don't live up to their values or how they want to see ourselves. They talk about the need to prioritize the collective good while amassing great personal wealth. They take private jets to climate change conferences. They'll talk about the need for gun control while enjoying the safety of armed private security services personally or at their workplaces. They'll talk about the need for tolerance of differing viewpoints and independent thought, while calling for people to be fired over social media posts. They'll tout the importance, even necessity, of higher education, without really probing whether college gives students their money's worth or whether colleges are really preparing young people for the working world. They talk about the importance of women's rights, right up until the moment their jaw-dropping harassment and assault scandals come out. Both sides will tout the importance of equality of opportunity, and then indulge in a little nepotism or hire a friend. The right wing. How do conservatives generally see liberals? Decadent, weak, sexually deviant, wildly hypocritical, greedy and in denial about their own greed, elitist, smug, hedonist, foolish, lazy and comfortably dependent upon the support of taxpayers, and unpatriotic among other faults. The left wing. How do liberals see conservatives? Hateful, intolerant, sexually repressed and/or secret deviants, wildly hypocritical, selfish, greedy, ignorant, callous, provincial, and xenophobic, among other faults. In other words, each side of our political divide thinks the opposition is rife with the traits that they disdain the most in themselves, traits that they like to believe they have successfully purged from themselves personally, and from their most important allies. This isn't really about political differences anymore. This is about needing an enemy that embodies everything we can't stand. About the world, yes, but probably about ourselves as well. Nobody explodes with rage about a complete stranger's prom dress unless they've got an enormous amount of anger within them that's just itching to find a suitable target. One of the great ironies about this moment is that the world has provided Americans with no shortage of nearly universally recognized genuine enemies. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all of the other assorted jihadists, drug cartels, authoritarian regimes, gangs, sex traffickers, hackers, and cyber criminals, arms smugglers. For Pete's sake, slavery still exists. In that light, how much anger should be spent on the social media controversy du jour, celebrities' comments about politics, or the latest abominable utterance of little-known political candidates. We probably don't see ourselves in jihadists, brutal regimes, or modern slavers, but we do see a reflection of ourselves in our counterparts on the other side. After all, they're Americans. They grew up in the same national culture that we did, shared many of the same experiences that we did, and yet somehow they developed viewpoints that are diametrically opposed to our sense of right and wrong. That's frightening, and something that triggers the urge to lash out. In other words, our political debates aren't all that much about politics anymore, at least as traditionally defined.
Addendum, tearing the veil of darkness away. Observations from obscurity.
Societies in crisis are tempted to maintain their corrupted national mythos by engaging in the incongruence of subjective selective truths, which is ironically how they arrived at crisis in the first place. Be it unintended or manufactured crisis, consider what I am telling you. Often, those who are engaged in what they know to be as evil and wrong will adopt a self-justified and even militant self-righteous stance towards others who are skeptical or been undecided as to their demands to comply with their dictates. These same ones also engage in the duplicity sowing fear and confusion even as they attempt to redefine the very words and deeds they have attempted to cover up. Thus they expose themselves in those very words and deeds as the outcomes become obvious to all the falsity of their proclamations and demands upon all others. They are inherently incapable of admitting their own insufficiencies even as they refuse to humble themselves and admit their wrongs. Thus they set about to project onto others blindly what they have done, are doing and plan to do, never thinking they are already stripped of their fig leaves and their whitewash standing naked before heaven and earth. They cannot see the shrinking of their power and influence even as their arrogance and vitriol is amplified. It is a pitiful condition which besets them in their darkness of heart and mind as their own self-delusions testify against them in the ineffable light of the truth. These are those who have become one with their shadows and unified in the corruptive darkness thereof. They are captured by their own lies which drag them to their end, telling them all the way to oblivion that they are the victims, when the truth is that they spent their lives victimizing all those with whom they had charge over and interactions with. Thus is the Tao of the tyrant and the fool prior to their fall and their reckoning. In their final state they are found to be mirrored opposites of how they have deceived themselves into seeing themselves. Those who follow blindly such beasts of men and women become like them, unwilling and incapable of seeing past the darkness in their own foreheads and hearts. Thus they share the same fate. As for people, so too for nations. Those who gloat unjustly now will certainly weep later. Those who weep now will rejoice later. Those who mourn with those who are suffering will be raised up in their compassion and lifted up in their humility and tenderness of heart. This is not the case for the evil, the callous, uncaring, unjust, and the arrogant ones, for they will be humiliated and learn the hard way why grace, encouragement, companionship, and compassion is so esteemed in their own time of crisis and hardship. As I look back in history, I find it is often the oldest civilizations who have learned the least from their past. This is so because they have also refused to take responsibility for their own insufficiencies and failures. These are those who prefer the choice of casting dispersions on those of others while multiplying their own in denial. They are like the old man who spent his life refusing wisdom and celebrating his own lack of it in his foolishness, only to arrive at the end of his life emptied of vigor in his frailties, isolated from friendship and refusing of mercy in his need by means of his past. Those who hate wisdom celebrate in their foolishness. Those who hate truth prove it by their hatred of wisdom by becoming fools. As for people, so too for the nations.
All paths lead to God, but not all paths lead out of the shadow to freedom, salvation, and restoration.
All paths do lead to God. How is this? All stand before God when they die and answer for all they have done in this life. It is there are but two kind of people, those who accepted the gift of salvation and those who rejected it in this life. There are but two kinds of people who stand before God, those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Your will is done, now depart from me, workers of iniquity, into everlasting darkness and torment." God loves humanity so much that he offered salvation to all who would accept it, the gift. A gift is not something that can be worked for or earned by works. It can only be humbly accepted. Those who think their works are greater than the gift of salvation offered freely are in pride of heart and slaves to the lie. Likewise, one cannot demand love from others, they can only example it. So too it is for tolerance and grace. One cannot demand these things and be in these things. They can only example these things. Those who demand love, tolerance, and grace are living in and from none of these things. Instead, they are living in opposition to them. Hence why they are deceived. They are inverted. They are exampling the lie, not living in truth. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. So not all paths are equal. There was but one way you can to be in this world. You were born. There is but one way you leave it in grace, having salvation. That is acceptance of the gift of salvation in Jesus. Thusly, why we say you must be born again, born spiritually in spirit and in truth from the inside out. No amount of outside and works will suffice, for they are temporal and are too weak to stand before the eternal holiness of God. In the same way, no one can use corruption to beget anything but that which is corrupt. So too it is for mortal works of the flesh. For the flesh is too weak to gain upon its own merits that which is beyond its temporal substance. For what does that which is temporary have beyond its temporalness? Nothing. It is for this reason God made a way himself by offering eternal life, being eternal salvation from this temporal paradox. As a gift, that gift is, was, and will always be the divine Logos, the Word made flesh, this being Jesus, the first of many divine offspring in, by and of his Spirit. This is why we say that God revealed himself in three persons, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of truth, and as you have heard, it is the truth which sets you free. This is the gift, and as I said earlier, a gift can only be accepted, not worked for. God offered this eternal gift to all humanity because temporal people cannot transcend their temporariness in their own wisdom and works. Why? Because all that is temporary is so because it has a definitive beginning and a definitive end. It is a product of finiteness. It is such because the OS of humanity was infected with the malicious code of corruption. This we call sin. The roots thereof is pride. It makes slaves of the prideful, leading those enslaved to itself towards their destruction. Hence why I told you about the definitive end. The law cannot offer salvation, for it is based in what you do in the temporal realm, and no one is without infractions of that perfect standard. Thusly, you cannot earn salvation. You can only accept salvation. While to accept something as a gift, you must be humble enough to realize that it is a gift, not a product to bought or merit to be earned, or else it would not be a gift. Those who refuse the gift think themselves and their temporality greater than what it is. This is pride, and it has blinded them to their predicament through deception and made them delusional in thinking and doing.
The zeitgeist is the shadow.
This is what we mean. We say that the spirit of this age has blinded the minds of people, deceiving them with lies in order to enslave them and devour them, all the while their pitiful souls think themselves enlightened, genius, and evolved without need of salvation, for their hearts and minds are dead to truth and darkness. Thusly they call good evil and evil good. They are living in a photographic-like negative of reality. This is why such people demand love. They demand tolerance. They demand that people accept their lies and delusions and become complicit with them. The lies demands they do so. They lie forces its way upon those who are not a slave to it, attempting to enslave them through the proxies or those who were slaves to itself. This is why such people and nations rule by fear and threats of forced complicity to tyranny. The autocratic society, ideological construct, the controlling individual all act the same way. They need a host like the lies which they are slaves to in order to continually feed the lies. The lie acts like a parasite upon the host. It demands absolute tolerance for its own actions while condemning others for theirs without regard to whether or not those actions are real or imagined. Those in a lie always try to force everyone else to first accept, then validate and ultimately serve the lie which holds sway over them. This is why dictatorial regimes demand absolute acceptance by the citizenry to the grand delusional narrative of the deified national myth obtained by lies, formed in lies and ruled by lies in order to enslave entire peoples, tribes, and nations. It is also why such regimes cannot tolerate any form of deviation from the talking points and forced narratives of the ruling elite, which live like a corrupt pantheon of false gods and goddesses over the enslaved masses. As it is for the many, so too it is for the individual enslaved by lies. Such people are in a constant fight or flight confirmation bias loop. They cannot tolerate anything that might challenge the lie which owns them. Thusly, the lie uses them as proxies to war against anything that might expose the nature to the light of truth, freeing those whom the lie wishes to dominate and control. This is nature of the spirit of the age. It seeks to tempt, confuse, ensnare, enslave, and then dominate the individual and even nations, disregarding the consequences to the individual or the citizens and the nations at large.
What is the lie of the shadow?
The lie always claims to be what it is not. It claims to be true even when all evidence to the contrary is present. It slanders, it accuses, it confuses, it manufactures false evidence to make itself appear true to deceive others. It projects what it has done, is doing, and plans to do on others in the form of accusations and slander, presenting reality in false light. So too do those who are enslaved by it. The lie weaponizes anything and everything it can to cast aspersions upon anything and anyone which might expose what it is, has done, and is doing. It waged war against the truth. Ironically, it does so to its own destruction. You see, a lie is not the absence of truth. It is the truth taken out of context and corrupted, for a lie cannot exist without the truth. The truth does not need a lie to be true. It is by its very nature true. It needs no external validation, yet the lie needs the very truth it wars against in order to have something to sustain itself. Here wherein is the great paradox. The lie, being rooted in pride, cannot accept the truth without giving up the pride and exposing itself, and no longer remain a lie, now can it? So the lie is ensnared in the same manner it ensnares peoples, tribes, and nations, projecting onto them what it is in order to self-sustain itself through subjugation of others it can feed upon. Thusly, why we say it is like a shadow cast upon the dust of the ground from a light source, the way which leads to destruction and death. For it is upon the temporal, or rather mortal flesh of humanity the lie feeds in order to continue to exist. So in a very real sense, like its dependence upon the truth for its existence, the lie is also dependence upon the peoples and the nations to continue being deceived and enslaved by it, lest they ever see the truth that humanity, even in its temporal form, is greater than it is and be set free from its grasps in the light of the truth. You see this play out when tyrannical, corrupted, evil, autocratic regimes fall, when their excesses and abuses eventually turn the enslaved against their enslavers, rebelling against the lies which held them in chains to the dictatorial regime. All things in this world have a definitive beginning and a definitive end. You cannot overcome the temporal with more temporality, for it is temporary. Temporary is not infinite. Nothing made in and of the temporary will transcend its temporariness. Thusly, your lives here in the definitive is bound to the finite temporariness. Yet why do the peoples and nations fear death? Or in other words, the definitive end. The definitive end is but the end of the temporary finite realm as experience and experience. You do know that all that has a definitive beginning and a definitive end points to something much greater than the finiteness of temporary existence. So again I ask you, why do you fear death? Death is the definitive end to your mortal experience in the darkness of this reality, bound to the clock upon the wall of finite time. You fear what is beyond it because down deep you know that you are holding on to something which will affect your existence beyond your current mortal life. What you fear is condemnation and or annihilation. Yet have you considered that the temporary realm of existence is temporary precisely for no other reason than to point you to something much grander? Yet it is that great unknown something which is what you fear beyond death. That should tell you something about what is beyond death and what you should be asking yourselves in the present temporal moment. That something you fear is truth. There is a reason we call this the valley of the shadow of death. For all here in this world, from greatest to the least, are under it. Yet, you at once want to know what is beyond death while being completely terrified of it. Could it be that you have been deceived in this present world into fearing something that had made you fearful that it might enslave you to your fear here and now, while blinding you to the greater reality which is to come beyond the definitive end of your temporal life? What if that deception of fear is in fact trying to keep you from the truth of what is beyond, precisely to keep you enslaved in the present and while trying to destroy your future beyond this present life? Perhaps you should look at your fear of the beyond as your chains in the present and seek the truth as to why you indeed feel the way you do. Perhaps the fear itself is a sign to you that something is wrong in your life. Perhaps it is time to investigate these things I have written to you about. Perhaps you should consider all I have told you in these short paragraphs as a call to your heart and mind towards freedom and liberty that far transcends what even the most free experience you have ever had might have elicited in you. Consider these words. Ponder them.
Duplicity and the 2 sets of books.
Growing up in a home which provided me sound emotional, spiritual and intellectual foundations is of greater value than all the gold bullion in the world. I was sitting here reflecting upon this as I half-heartedly perused my info feeds for my nightly updates before bed, when a certain article caught my attention. It was a rather mundane summary of the global market news from across many sectors. Then suddenly this phrase exploded into my mind from childhood Sunday school. This is what the phrase said. And all the books were opened. Immediately another thought punctuated my thoughts in direct relationship to the previous one. It was this: there are many kinds of books. We often talk about how each of us have a life story. These human stories are in a sense books. After all, we even use the phrase, don't judge a book by its cover, when talking about making assumptions as to how people, places, and things may appear rather than how they are. It was then my mind linked back to all the economic data in the article I had been reading. That was then it hit me. The phrase popped back into my mind again. And all the books were opened. The lives of all people and the financial books of all governments, institutions, organizations, and companies. Just like double-minded, duplicitous people, I wonder how many organizations have 2 sets of financial books. One for the public and one which is the real financial books that the public never sees. You know, the kind of financial books that the mobsters employed brilliant accounts and actuaries that large financial institutions employ to manage the fake books and the real books. There are many duplicitous people in the world, which means that there are a whole lot of duplicitous financial dealings going on behind the public facade as well, regardless of whether it is within governments, financial institutions, and any other myriad of human organizational constructs. What do you suppose will happen when all those books are opened? And to what lengths will they go to in order to keep up the faux facade of legitimacy? I think we know the answer to that. Duplicity in financial markets and governments always find their causality in a duplicity of heart and minds of people. Thusly, in the end, there will be but 2 sets of human storybooks. Those which have their destination in the fire and those whose stories having been written from the inside out by the fire, which will be stories which live on forever without end. Such are classic stories, and the others are but trashy novels which no one remembers anymore. Hence why all things are tested with fire, which gives both light to see and separates the darkness from itself by burning away that which in darkness. Yes, in the end all the books will be opened and all accounts settled. Don't you think it is time to stop living in and for the shadows of the real as people and as nations? For the time will come when all shadows will flee and dissipate in the bright shining eternal light which even now shines on forever. It is by this light I see these things and offer them to you to consider. All things will be and even now are being revealed to those with ears to hear and eyes to see. May it be that you are found among those who are as such. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. And yes, even financial institutions and industries.
A visit to a place between what was and what will one day be.
I occasionally visit a famous cemetery in Richmond, Virginia to walk by the elaborately ornate Gothic tombs of the long departed. It struck me how garden-like our places of the dead are as I explored the grounds and pondered what the lives of the politicians, great businessmen, intellectuals, and countless others of influence and wealth must have been like. It is quite possibly one of the most serene yet melancholy places to take walk through and find a quiet place to consider what was, what is, and what it is that may come. One particular day I took a break from my work and drove to Hollywood Cemetery with a guitar and a vellum-encased journal, hoping to decompress and perhaps write some without the ever-present distractions of the busy, typical, fast-paced urban lifestyle. It is my ritual to park my car and walk to President's Circle and sit by the tomb of President Monroe and many of his contemporaries. It has a lovely view of downtown in the distance and the relaxing sound of the James River rapids just below this high spot overlooking them both. That particular spring day, the flowers and the trees were glorious in their colors, and all seems new and alive after a rather long and dreary winter. As I sat down, I thought it rather ironic that I was feasting upon such visual display, living color in the flora and fauna in a garden that was really a cemetery. As I sat there considering that odd juxtaposition, looking out across the innumerable ornate tombs, statuary, and monuments, my vision saw the high-rises building through them off in the distance, looking no different than the stoneworks of the tombstones I was viewing them through. A dark potent came with a chill and the sudden rustling of hundreds ravens the nearby trees. It seemed we had both felt the chill of something in the air. As I sat there, I realized I was sitting at the ultimate destination all those people in the distant downtown bustling and myself would eventually wind up at. A garden built for goodbyes. The differences between where I was and where they faded into the same thing. The down skyline and these towering, elaborate gravestones and tombs were mirrors of one another. They were at once like the opposing bookends of the same book. I reached down for the familiar soft leather of my vellum journal, opened to an empty page, and penned this requiem with only the ghosts of the past and the ravens in the present granting me company. The name of this writing was called The Garden of Goodbyes, a Requiem. We so often spend our lives trying to recover that pale, misty ghost of Eden. Try we do in such desperation to remember that beloved garden as its fading evades our mind's grasp. Many a soul hath been lost to the chasing of that fading glory. Here we do build kingdoms in sand, always telling ourselves this time will defy the high tide and its dark waves. Dark waves which seek to wash away all our truest hopes and dreams, replacing the precious with contorted counterfeits. Oh, how these finite shells of flesh deceive. In the noonday sun we chase after the shadows, hoping to soothe our dearest desires, God-given yet broken. This too is but building upon the sandy shores of a story sea. For try as we might, Tiamat fashions iron fists of our fears, bringing down upon our illusions, crushing things that pretend. Those shadows cannot suffice. They are but the treacherous games of lust and fear. Oh, how they offer so much even as they chain us in never enoughs. It is this which maketh animals of the civilized and demons out of our angels. Cast them not away, they whisper in our thoughts. In our weakest moments they demand servitude to their lostness. My beloved, the shadows shall never satisfy those truest desires, nor the good hungers which endow them to our souls. Just as the salt dark waters of the sea cannot quench thirst, only increase our empty wanting. How easily we are fools for those lukewarm stolen waters. Even still our innermost parts pant for our heavenly Father's living waters. Still the shadows' lies run their diabolical course. Yes, it is true, the weakness of flesh desires nothing of eternal substance. So thou we do endeavor in great energies to cajole ourselves into a phantom of belief, even as we flee our heart's truest forms to once again chase after the wind, only to be covered with dust and ash. How long shall we pursue those shadows of our truest selves? How long shall we run far from our hearts? Wherefore do the heart's desires take root and blossom in such darkened portents, ignored in the false light of the shadow's temptations? It cannot be found in gardens turned graveyards strewn across the lands of our thoughts. No, it cannot take root in the false portents of yesterday still haunting our present vision. My beloved, fertile ground for the seeds of truest desire can only be planted in the good soils of love's acceptance. forgiveness, and our Heavenly Father's grace. 'Tis true, though mortal could quake at the thought of it, for our flesh is bound to temporary, which reels back from that which is fashioned in eternal glories. So here I sit once again in the garden of goodbyes, surrounded by the monuments of those long departed for the peaceful eternal shores and timeless. These monuments mere markers to lives whose absence points us still beyond our frail mortality to the forever lands which our true hearts and their truest desires were fashioned to lead us towards. Ponder this, my dear one. Why might our cities, so grand in their banality, all have gardens built for goodbyes? And are they planted with seeds of lost Eden and watered with a sea of tears? For in this valley of decision, where the shadows dance to temptation and death and all that heaven's hope did not survive, we travel a path so many left, even through the garden of goodbyes. Nothing of value lasting beyond momentary breaths shall ever quench the search for more but that perfect love which dawns in hearts alive, exposing our never-enoughs. So let these words sink in thy heart and find a place to take root. For if they do, you will awake from the night to see your truest desires bloom. Let not the shadows nor their lies nor their temptations steal from you. For my beloved, we are so much more than mortal coils locked in fleshy tombs, as we travel through these shadowlands populated with counterfeit hues. Always remember who you are, and that my love shall forever be for you. Not distance nor darkness can eclipse our hearts when they are in bloom, for we are trees who bear fruit in their time, defying the days and nights so cruel. Let not the cares of the kingdoms of sand keep chains upon thy soul, nor accept the shadows of real from their pale lusty tombs. Do not turn back from the less traveled path to weep for yesteryear. Look forward and let your heart breathe the air of truth and love. I shall not spin fables to deceive thee, for the journey through fear 'tis hard, yet know that its yoke is light compared to the shadow's weighty loads. You see, my dear, I say these things not to push you away. Oh no, I could not think of such travail, still I yearn for you to stay. However, upon this road further up and farther in towards our Father's keep, I know I cannot be a stumbling block, only a man who believes. My prayers are for those truest desires in thee to bloom in that holiest of soils. 'Tis my reason for asking of God, remove all of the shadow stones and all their chains from you. I commit you to hands of our Father, even as my flesh trembles and protests, trusting that one day even in this place I might see thy smile anew. Take thy hand into mine, look into your eyes, and know your heart is broken through the surface of flesh, the realm in which thy fears and chains have long held you fast. Though I can see them losing their strength, knowing thy heart is near breakthrough, I long for the day thy heart 'tis unimpeded, and to shadows you have said your goodbyes to. For on that day your love will bloom, allowing me to love you. Knowst thou, my dear, you have not been alone in this valley of shadows, where the falsity of fig leaves are fashioned by fears. Oh no, for it hath been a millstone around my neck since my youth as well, nearly drowning me in dark tears. 'Tis a lie to play pretend and say it not to thee, that which 'tis true you about those shadows of me. Such a bitter travail to turn from temptation's desire, for flight away to stand firm, even face to face with those yesterdays, to vanquish them from my mind and soul so diseased. Do not think in this time where the darkness prowls, good work evades not my own soul. Like you, I have been long in phantom chains I had grown intimately used to. 'Tis true, beloved, I have been a sojourner upon this narrow path homeward many a year now. Seasons charge and retreat in their great circles, wearing away the old man even as the new man grows stronger within. Those shadows still knock on the gates of my soul, seeking entry into places they no longer have space in. Of this I do sing. I am made anew, freed from the tyrant of sin. Hear thee these truths. We are as living stones surrounded by the washing away of the sand. Living stones fit together without mortal hands. Truest of pedigree sprang forth from heaven's fount. Our divine Father, offspring led by his love homeward bound. Nothing on earth nor skies above can taketh away his eternal love. Not temporal kingdoms fashioned in sand, nor fallen phantoms who lure with never-enoughs shall erase our names from the Lamb's living book of love. Not tempest nor distance, no, not these, shall steal us away from the life he hath breathed into you and me. Not past nor present nor future to come can blot out what God's Son hath already done. For our history was written before history begun, the victory which comes long since won. So with these last words, until next we shall meet. conceived in my beloved's heart once received, even if for the briefest of our momentary. Regret did not come near the tent of my soul. Thy graces blessed my heart, setting it abloom in defiance to the callousness once shrouded. For this I am grateful amidst the melancholy, as I journey onward to that holy mountain. So here I sit in this garden of goodbyes, knowing these words are hellos to new chapters of life. Life filled with truth and eternal love's light. Thusly I shall not bid thee goodbye. Only my prayers and love until we find our hearts reaching out through the noise, the lies, and the shadows smooth, free at last to share our smiles and our greatest hope. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Othniel Max Daves.